Hi, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I appreciate you watching the videos and the comments. You can join our Facebook group and page, and you can share the videos quite easily there. So please go to Facebook under Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I have a great story today. A lot of people have heard of John Tanner. He's known as the man who saved the Kirtland Temple from going into foreclosure, but he was an amazing man of incredible faith. And I'd like to give some more detail about the story of his life because it's inspiring. He was born in 1778 in Rhode Island, and when he was 13 years old, he traveled with his family to Greenwich, New York, and was a hard worker and an industrious young man. He married his first wife before they had their first child. His father passed away. John was left to settle the affairs of his estate, and then he and his wife moved to Lake George, New York. Back in those days, the waterways, the canals, the rivers, and the lakes were like the interstate transportation system. People rode in canal boats and ships across the Great Lakes, and Lake George was a very long lake that ran north and south. So he was in a great place where a lot of people came through, and he was an industrious man. He worked hard. He purchased a big tract of timber, 2,200 acres, and had a lumber mill. He soon owned 2 farms. He had a huge orchard. He started a dairy. He had an implement store. He even owned an island, 2 hotels, several homes, and people were attracted to him because of his positive attitude. He was a Baptist lay minister, so he was a man of great faith. And everyone in the community really looked up to him and respected him. Whenever he saw a situation, he didn't pause or complain or wonder what to do. He just moved forward quickly and did what he thought was best, and he had great instincts. He's one of those people that seemed to know when to sell at the high point and when to get out. He came home one afternoon after work, and 2 of his children had been bitten by a rabid dog. And he tried to capture the animal because it had just gone crazy. The dog bit him on the calf. And that was a fatal injury in those days quite often. And so he immediately took a pair of sheep shears and cut the infected flesh around the wound out and filled it with salt. And then he hired a doctor, and through herbs and prescriptions, he was able to heal his 2 children and keep them from being affected long term by rabies. That's the way he lived. He just did what needed to be done. He became one of the most respected men in the whole area because he owned a lot of property, but he was a benevolent, good man, and he would help out those in need. And he was charitable to his fellow men. When he was in his early 50s, he began to be plagued by a terrible condition. It started with open sores on his thigh that began to ooze infective material, and soon they turned black and spread down his leg, and his leg swole up. He couldn't bend it, he couldn't put any weight on it, and he battled it for 6 months. He had 7 different doctors attend him, and he spent a great deal of money trying to solve this issue. He didn't want to quit work, and so he built a rough wheelchair of the time, and in that conveyance was able to take himself around town and see what was going on, but he still was confined substantially because of the pain and the inability that he had to even put weight on his leg. And Dr. Black, the best doctor he had found and the last one he was working with, finally told him, "John, you got 2 choices. You can die or we can amputate this leg." And he said, "I came into this world with this leg and I'm going out with it." He refused to follow the doctor's advice. So he continued to move about town and try to conduct his business as well as he could. In his travels, he saw some notices that there were two missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who were planning to hold a meeting in his town. And he thought, I may be crippled up, but I can still help my community. I'm going to go to this meeting and I'm going to correct these two misguided souls. He talked with some of the other brethren in the local Baptist congregation, and they decided, yeah, we're going to go set those two elders straight. And so that's what they did. Elder Simeon and Elder Jared Carter, they were brothers on a mission, were the two elders that had come to Lake George. And that evening when they got to the meeting, his friends were ready to heckle and harass these guys, and he sat right front and center as his friends did. And the elders knew the gospel. They had assumed they could correct them biblically and set them straight with scriptures, but they were quoting scriptures and they were talking about the restoration of priesthood. They were talking about things, and then they began to talk about the Book of Mormon. And at that point, his friends left. They didn't want to hear any more. But John's antagonistic spirit had been extinguished with the Spirit of the Lord. And he began to feel the spirit of truth. He began to believe what they said. He interrupted them as they talked about the Book of Mormon. He said, where can I get one of those books? After the meeting, the two elders met with him. They went to his home, and they had a vigorous conversation because he got out of his Bible and they began to converse and talk about the restoration of the priesthood, the appearance of the Father and the Son to Joseph Smith, the scriptural content of the Book of Mormon compared to the biblical scriptures that he believed so heartily in. And by 11 o'clock that night, the conversation had gone long into the night, and he said, I believe that you have the priesthood, and I would love to be baptized, but my condition would prevent that. I can't get in the water. So Simeon looked at him, he said, do you believe that Christ healed the lame man outside the waters of Bethesda? And he goes, well, of course I do. And then he said, do you believe that he gave the authority of the priesthood to the apostles? And he goes, well, yes. Simeon went on, he said, so you believe that Peter used that priesthood to heal the lame man outside the temple? And he said, yes. And he goes, well, has God lost the power to do that? And he said, well, of course not. And he said, well, has he gotten disinterested in this earth and gone somewhere else and doing something else? He goes, well, no, that's ridiculous. And they continued on. He said, well, then he doesn't love the children on earth now as much as he did back then? He goes, no, he loves all of his children. He's an unchangeable God. Simeon Carter looked at him and said, if he is an unchangeable God, I testify to you that priesthood has been restored. And at that point, his brother Jared got up and commanded him to rise and walk. And this is what Brother Tanner said. I arose, I threw down my crutches, and walked the floor back and forth, praising God. I felt as light as a feather. He asked the elders if he could be baptized right then. It was after 11 o'clock, and they walked 3/4 of a mile without assistance, without crutches, without a cane. He walked down to the water's edge. He was baptized by Jared Carter, and then they walked back to his home. That was the first time he'd walked in 6 months, and he was completely healed. The wounds were closed, they disappeared, and he was completely restored to health. He became a staunch believer in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the restoration of the gospel in the latter days. He was a great supporter of those who wanted to go to the Kirtland area, but he had a substantial amount of property, so he assisted others in going. When he was told about the word of wisdom, just typical of his faith, even though he'd used tea and coffee and tobacco, and he gave up everything. He gave his big bag of coffee beans to a neighbor, and they all questioned what he was doing and why he would be involved with such a thing. But during that time, he financed 7 different families on their travel and as they left to go to Kirtland. In the fall of 1834, he felt compelled to sell his property, and he sold 2 farms, a vast orchard system, 2,200 acres of timber, a sawmill, an island, an implement store, several homes, a dairy, and 2 hotels. John had a gift to know when to sell, and he got a handsome price, and he planned to leave in the spring, because it was now late fall, and go to Kirtland. In the middle of December, he had a dream or night vision in which he was told he was needed immediately in Kirtland. So he got up the next morning and told his family of his plans to leave as soon as they could prepare themselves. And as he shared his plans with his neighbors and the other members of his old congregation, they tried to discourage him. They'd given up on trying to get him away from the LDS faith, but they said, "John, that's a 500-mile journey, and you're older, and it's the middle of winter." But he was compelled to go. And so on Christmas Day in 1834, he and his family left Lake George for Kirtland, and they arrived on the 20th of January. The day after he arrived, in the morning, he received word that Joseph Smith and the 12 apostles that were there would like to meet with him. Well, meantime, while he'd done all this with his property, there'd been a situation developed in Kirtland. The apostles and the prophet were busy doing everything they were doing. They had missionaries all over. Many of the apostles were gone. They had been building the Kirtland Temple, and they had built the foundation, and the walls were built up. They had signed a $2,000 note, a promissory note, to the man that owned the land. And when he saw these beautiful stone walls up as high as they were, he became a little covetous and decided that he was going to foreclose the temple property. They were given notice that on January 21st, the property of the temple, along with the work that had been done on that property, would be seized and that they would lose it. And when the apostles and the temple committee had talked about this, Joseph said, "Don't worry, we just need to pray." John Tanner was the answer to that prayer. They explained the situation to John, and he went and immediately paid the man the $2,000 in cash. And then he allowed the prophet Joseph Smith to sign a promissory note with terms for the $2,000. He became a staunch supporter of the temple. He lent the temple committee $13,000 to finish the work of the temple. To put it in today's funds, the church just purchased this building back in the property for over $190 million. So he gave them a huge amount of money. He also lent them money for supplies and for implements and for different needs that he had access to. During this time, he lent the church over $50,000, and all he ever accepted were signature loans for them. Father Tanner is what he became known as, and Father Tanner was able to participate in the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. And a week later, he was at the solemn assembly when Jesus Christ appeared and accepted that building as the house of the Lord. His son was outside. He saw angels on the roof of the temple and floating above the temple. So their whole family received a spiritual manifestation that this was the work of the Lord that they were involved in. At that time, the Kirtland Bank had started, and there were some real problems with that. There was a Judas under the counter, is the way I've heard it put. John Tanner bought note after note for that bank to keep it afloat. But someone was siphoning funds out the backside, and the bank went belly up. John Tanner was devastated financially. At that point, he had lost everything. Now, the Kirtland Bank situation caused some of the apostles to apostatize, some of the first presidency, and even today, people who become semi-acquainted with some of the information have apostatized from the church. And I find it very interesting that the man who lost financially more than anyone else never wavered. He never questioned it. He knew it was the work of the Lord and that Joseph Smith was the prophet of the Lord. And he didn't question just because Joseph Smith was a human being and couldn't do everything that he was involved with perfectly. He knew that it was the work of the Lord. He never complained. He never wavered. But he was financially devastated. And in April of 1838, he had an old horse and he borrowed a wagon. And because of the mobs in Kirtland, he and his family left the Kirtland area. They left on that journey of 1,000 miles with $20 and a keg of powder. On that journey, he had to beg to feed his family and his children. He had 11 members of his family with him. And on that journey, he lost his young daughter who had been born in Kirtland. When he arrived in Far West, some of the less steady saints questioned his devotion to the kingdom. And he said, well, if others have come up easier, they have not learned as much as I have. He got back to work, not discouraged, and he built another farm. He paid off his debts. And this was all amid huge mob violence taking place. The Mormon Wars were taking place. And one afternoon, his son Myron and he were walking 9 miles to a mill. And as they were walking, they were suddenly attacked by the Missouri militia. And Captain Meyer Odell strode up to him and put his dragoon up to his head and fired, and and he took the gun and smashed him across the head. And he had a thick felt hat on, and that saved his life because it still crushed his head and split his skull wide open, and he was bleeding like crazy, and he was taken to prison. During that time, the Missouri militia finally defeated Joseph Smith and the men who were trying to defend themselves with him. General Lucas commanded General Alexander Doniphan to execute the Mormons. And General Doniphan said, it's cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade shall march to Liberty tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal. So help me God. So General Lucas backed down, and the prisoners were released, and John Tanner was released with them at that point. But Governor Boggs's extermination order was still in effect. The mobs had taken everything, and again, John Tanner had to flee from his home, leave his property, and flee with the saints. He settled in Montrose, Iowa, right across the river from Nauvoo. For 5 years, he rebuilt and continued to be a faithful member of the church. And in the spring conference of 1844, he was called on a mission to go to the eastern states. Before he left on his mission, he went across the river to Nauvoo, and he met with Joseph Smith. He handed him the $2,000 promissory note that Joseph had signed. He was preparing to go on a mission. He didn't have anything to go with or anything to support his family with. Joseph looked at the note, and he said, what do you want me to do with this? And he said, you're welcome to it. Do it the way you want. And Joseph Smith was touched. And he reached out his hand and put it on his shoulder. He said, God bless you, Father Tanner. Your children will never beg for bread. John filled a mission to the eastern states. He returned and sold his farm in 1846. Again, he was in a good location, better than Nauvoo, and he got a fair price for the property. And he moved to Council Bluffs. That was Indian territory. During that time, the Mormon battalion was mustered, and he outfitted 2 of his sons with fine equipment and many other men. He sent more than a dozen men with equipment to join the Mormon battalion. But he was older, and he stayed home. During that time, he spent 3 months by himself herding all the cattle and animals and keeping the livestock contained at Council Bluffs. And that January, his home and everything he had was destroyed by fire. He was amazing. He didn't let it bother him. So at 69 years old, he again had lost everything. And he didn't whine and cry about it. He just got back to work. And 69 back then was a lot older than it is now. But he rebuilt the farm. He built another home. And he was able to help many members as they tried to make their way across the plains to Utah that year. In the fall that year, he took his granddaughter and another couple of girls just down from the farm a little ways to pick elderberries. He dropped them off near the bushes, and just as he turned the wagon, he was attacked by Indians. And the girls were in the bushes, and they looked out and saw what was going on, and his granddaughter and a lady named Jane Grover ran up and jumped on the wagon. And Jane said to him, "I'm going to run for the house." And he said, "No, if you run for the house, they'll kill you." And pretty soon, two of the Indians had a hold of the horse bridles, and so the wagon wouldn't move. And they dragged John off the wagon. They began to strip his clothing, and they took his watch and his handkerchief out of his pocket. It was obvious to the girls what they planned to do. The Indians were going to kill John, and they were going to carry these two young women off. She stopped amid all this violence and commotion and said a silent prayer. And the Spirit of the Lord fell on her. And in the face of death and all this travesty, Jane felt a peace and happiness come over her. And the Spirit of the Almighty fell on her, and she felt empowered. And it was an undescribable feeling. And she stood up, and she looked at the Indians, and she began to chide them and to chastise them in their own tongue, and she didn't know the language. She rebuked the Indians, and soon the Indians let go of Father Tanner. They dropped his clothing. They let go of the horses, and they all gathered in front of her while she read them the riot act. She understood what she was saying, even though she was saying it in a language that she didn't understand. She said, "Don't you know the Great Spirit is watching you and knows everything in your hearts? We have come out here to gather some of our Father's fruit. We have not come to injure you. And if you harm us or injure one hair of our heads, the Great Spirit will smite you to the earth, and you will not have power to breathe another breath. We have been driven from our homes, and so have you. We have come out here to do good and not injure you. We are the Lord's people, and so are you. But you must cease your murders and wickedness. The Lord is displeased with it, and will not prosper you if you continue in it. You think you own this land, and this timber, and this water, and all these horses. You do not own anything on earth, not even the air you breathe. It belongs to the Great Spirit." It humbled the Indians out after this rebuking from this young woman. And they gave back Brother Tanner's clothing, and he gave them a handkerchief. And they shook hands with John and with all the young ladies, and they gave them their bread and their berries, and then sent them on their way. And then Brother Tanner yelled to the girls that were hiding in the bushes, and they came and got in the wagon and went back to the home. Later that year, in June 1848, John Tanner, with 5 wagons and the teams and 18 months' supplies, headed out for Salt Lake. When they were near Laramie, Wyoming, his grandson fell off the tongue of the wagon and was run over by a heavy wagon, both wheels, and it killed him. But that was the only terrible mishap. And a lot of people in losing a grandson or a child really struggle, and anyone that's lost a child or a grandchild knows what I'm talking about. But John Tanner and his family continued on. They arrived in Salt Lake on October 17th in 1848, and they began to work just as he had done everywhere he had all of his life. He settled the South Cottonwood area below Little Cottonwood Canyon. John passed away on January 13th, 1850, at the age of 72. It's estimated that he gave more than $50,000 to the church in cash. And he also gave an innumerable amount of equipment and supplies to the saints as they made their efforts to join the Zionist movement wherever they were going at the time. He was a faithful man. He passed through some terrible trials, but he never wavered. He never questioned his testimony. He knew that God loved him. Despite the hardships of this world, he knew that God was watching over him and all of his children. His progenitors include President N. Eldon Tanner and a favorite of mine, Hugh B. Brown. He was an amazing man. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. Please like and subscribe here. And if you like this story, you'd probably like this one. You can watch all of the Sunshine for the Soul stories right here. Thank you.